Hello, everyone, and welcome to National Youth Writers Festival for another year. Today we'll be talking about trauma, journalism and trauma generally. My name's Jacinta Bowler. We've got some fabulous guests here today. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country. We've also got, well, I'll let the people introduce themselves. Jarni, do you want to start?
Yes, my name is Jarni Blakkarly. I'm a journalist coming from Wurundjeri country as well.
Zoe?
My name is Zoe Simmons. I'm a journalist and copywriter coming from Wurundjeri country. And for visual description, in case anyone can't see, is using a screen reader, I have pale skin, pink hair, purple hair, and red lips.
And Erin?
Hi, I'm Erin Stewart from Ngunnawal country. I'm a writer, and I guess I have dark hair and glasses and very pale.
I'm also pale. I have a beautiful jacket on, lots of colors, and I have glasses as well. Jarni, if you want to go, sorry.
So I'm wearing a black shirt and slightly tanned skin. Yeah.
So journalists have a really unique relationship to trauma, I think. You might have to be interviewing someone about the worst day of their life with the burden of making sure you tell their story in the best way possible. Or you might be writing about your own trauma. Just starting out in journalism, it's become quite common to write about your own traumatic experiences to make your name for yourself before embarking on a career. Or you could just be doing your job and it matches up to what you're living through outside of that. COVID, Black Lives Matter, and bushfires are all examples where it's not easy to switch off at the end of the day if you're also living through it. So, journalism in trauma. I wanted to start off asking everybody why they got into journalism, because I feel like that's an interesting way of realizing why we did this in the first place and why we put ourselves through this all the time. So, Erin, do you want to start? Why did you get into journalism and writing?
Yeah, so I am probably not a journalist. I've never been employed as a journalist. I've been freelance writing since 2012, and a lot of the sort of work that I've done has ended up requiring me to use the skills of journalism and I think the ethics of journalism. But yeah, I don't really have any formal background in journalism. But I mean, really why I was interested in it is just because I really like the craft of writing, and I like telling stories. I like being able to ask people personal questions and for that to be safe and okay. I am really curious about the world around me, and I think that's obviously that then leads down to stories that are quite traumatic and that kind of thing. But I feel like there's so much benefit to telling these stories that I'm kind of happy to go with it. Even obviously we can talk about safety and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that's what really appealed to me was being able to write and being able to talk to people and being able to connect with people. Yeah,
I definitely feel like I got into journalism because I just wanted to ask people questions and find out cool stuff on a daily basis. Definitely relate to that a lot. So Zoe, what about you?
I actually, when I was younger, I wanted to be an author from kindergarten, but I realized that would probably be a bit hard starting out. So I did my Year 10 work experience in my local newspaper, and I just fell in love with journalism. That was about 10 years ago now, and it led me to doing a degree and freelancing for publications all around the world. And I just love the power of storytelling and how words can just communicate things that nothing else can in the same way, and how they can change perceptions and help people not feel so alone. So I am very happy I fell into journalism.
And Jarni?
Yeah, so I kind of, as a teenager, kind of had a hunkering that I wanted to do journalism, but wasn't quite sure. I basically got my start over in Malaysia, interning at a news publication over there, doing mostly political news, but also being really thrown into the deep end. And we can talk about more about trauma, but I would have been 18 years old and sent off to a site where a bus had gone off the edge of a cliff with about 30 people on board. And got to spend all day watching them bring the bodies up. So quite straight into that really full-on reporting. And since then I've been doing, but it's really that curiosity, talking to people, and the craft of writing that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I think, well, the next question I had was, like, I think we've pretty much described it just then. Like, how would you describe trauma? And I feel like all of those things definitely relate to that. What should we be looking out for generally as a journalist? Maybe if someone's starting new, or that kind of thing. Like, what do you want to be watching out for in your journalism practice or writing practice more generally? Jarni, do you want to start? Sorry, I don't know which one to go for.
Yeah, no, sure. I think it's just about being sensitive and connecting to people. I mean, it's hard when you're on really tight deadlines and you've got a really quick turnaround. You sometimes just need to kind of get in, get a quote, and get out. But when you are dealing with people who have trauma or who are experiencing the worst day of their life or talking about something that is incredibly traumatic, I think it's just about taking that time, sitting with someone, without the tape recorder on, without the camera on, and actually just connecting with that person as a human being before you actually get to the messy end of journalism and having to get a quote or whatever it is you need to get done. So I think just coming to people from that real human perspective is important always.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone have anything else they want to add? I won't keep asking individual questions, so if anyone wants to jump in, feel free.
I think that point. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Right. Yeah, I think that point about like you're a human before you're a writer or before you're a journalist is really important. I think like so often people can get carried away with like, oh, actually, I need to chase this story. I need to chase this story. But I think the building relationships and giving people space to be ready to talk to you or to disclose what they're willing to and to have certain things private, I think it's really important, and it's like a really humane way of approaching your work. And I think that's incredible, especially with trauma, where you can often feel like a story isn't really your own, and that unto itself can be re-traumatizing, I think.
Yeah.
I do also think it's important for young writers to understand that we aren't always entirely aware of the trauma we experience. I know certainly when I've done some stories that have been quite, unpleasant, people going through literally the worst possible things anyone can go through, and you don't realize it until you look back and realize, that did actually have an impact. I certainly didn't realize it when I was starting out. I was just so focused on, storytelling and helping people and sharing things that I thought were important that I didn't realize the impact it had. So I think it's definitely important for young journalists in particular to be mindful of that, as well as older journalists that maybe haven't thought about it.
Yeah. So I don't want to go too deeply into this if you're not comfortable with it. But if you are comfortable, I would love to hear an example of a time that you might have written about a traumatic story and how it did affect you. For me personally, I think that I'm very lucky to work in science journalism where I don't need to deal with this stuff very often. But I think that COVID especially was quite an eye-opening one for me, that you can be dealing with this stuff on a daily basis and it can be really rough. So what about you guys? It's very low on the list, but yeah, if anyone can give an example of what they've written about and how they dealt with it.
So I think probably the one that really sticks with me is I was freelancing for Al Jazeera and doing stories about Nauru and particularly the suicide kind of crisis and the spate of suicides that were happening on Nauru among the detainees there. And that was one that really stuck with me for a long time because I was interviewing this guy and he started sharing very kind of dark thoughts that he was having. And it's a very difficult place to be put in because, you want to be able to tell him, it's going to be okay and everything's going to work out. But I mean, I don't know how you can say that honestly with someone who is stuck in a detention center facing that situation. So that's a story that's really stuck with me for a long time. And there's one of many examples, but I think those, when you spend a lot of time talking to someone and they do disclose stuff like that, it really does stay with you as well.
Yeah, that's awful. Has anyone else got one they'd want to add? We don't need to talk about this as well.
You can go.
Sorry, I did it again. I was just going to say, I think as journalists, we have a lot of traumatic stories that we go through. But one I think that sticks the most for me was ones that I also had lived experience in. So I think for me, particularly covering the 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfires. I visited my hometown to get stuck in my hometown in the bushfires. So I was also experienced at the same time telling my story, but also, you know, people from my community that, you know, had woken up that morning and to see the fire across the road and lose their houses, to, you know, listen to people that thought their parent was dead for days because they couldn't get in touch. You know, stories of people having fireballs the size of semi-trailers raining down, and it's just there's so much. It really does last with you, definitely, especially, yeah, you're delving into people's deepest, darkest bits of trauma, and that does definitely leave an impact, I think.
For me, so I published a book this year called The Missing Among Us, which is stories of missing persons. And in that, I was looking at a range of different stories about missing persons, including like relatives of missing persons who'd been missing for decades in some cases, or people who had been, like, their child had been victim of abduction, or and also looking at like cases of mass disappearances, so refugees and stolen generations and that kind of thing. And I think, like, it was really like talking to people who had done quite a lot of work, I think, in like digesting that trauma. Like often it had happened like many years before they spoke to me. And a lot of it had been through like therapy and this kind of thing, or had been involved in a nonprofit or charity related to missing persons. So to some extent, I felt like that did protect both of us from like the really raw, like immediate impact from trauma. But I think as well, like working in these stories for such a long period of time was like, it wasn't traumatic for me per se, but it was like, I had this huge sense of responsibility. Like I had to do a really good job of telling these stories. Otherwise, you know, like what if I get like a small thing incorrect? Then I'm like, you know, kind of undermining their whole story, you know, this sort of thing. And so this kind of perfectionism or, just a responsibility, like beyond what most people would pick up was probably how it affected me. Which I think is good in a way. Like you want to be accurate, you want to, you know, tell things fairly, and yeah, as accurately as possible. But yeah, that was pretty much what kind of kept me off, you know, every so often. It's like, oh God, I better double check that I got that bit right, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I definitely feel like making sure that the stories that you're telling of other people, these really important stories get told in the best possible way. So we've talked about this a little bit already, but are there any particular ways that you do approach an interview or a subject for a story if that person has been through quite significant trauma? So what sensitivities are you trying to keep in mind when this happens?
I think you definitely have to be mindful of their mental state and not to assume how they're feeling either. I definitely found, you know, interviewing people like right after they'd lost their homes, you know, you acknowledge the discomfort, you acknowledge that it's so hard to speak, and you tell them that, you know, if you need to stop at any time when we're talking, that's totally fine, and only share what you're comfortable with, and, you know, let them know that you care about them more than just a story, and just, you know, putting yourself in their shoes, as well as I think sometimes it's quite handy to, I guess, highlight the impact of what telling their story could do. Like it could be helping raise funds or raising awareness about something or helping someone to not feel so alone. So I tend to highlight those, and I think it takes the edge off sometimes because they feel like it's not just, you know, delving their deepest, darkest things they've been through. It's, you know, it may actually create change, and I think that helps a lot of people to talk about their stories sensitively.
Yeah, I was finding that too. Like people were telling me that, oh yeah, the reason why I'm talking to you is because I hope it helps someone else. And I, when people are motivated like that, it is really helpful, I think, because they've obviously thought about where their story sits in like a context and how it could help other people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just about not being exploitative about it and approaching the person with honesty and approaching them with a real clear sense of what you're going to use the story for, the types of questions you're going to ask. I mean, but also not kind of, I guess, I mean, people often have made the decision that they do want to talk to a journalist and they do want to share their story. So I think sometimes you can maybe not be overly sensitive, but I mean, sometimes you can kind of tiptoe around an issue instead of getting kind of to the point in a way that is maybe not helpful as well. And the people have made the informed decision. They want to talk to you. They want to share their story. So sometimes just getting to the point around that is also the best way to approach it, I think.
Yeah.
I think sorry.
There's a lot of like potential benefit to sharing your story, which I think people might not be aware of, which like when you things like death knocks and stuff, people will say like that's horrendous on its like just on the face of it. But like for some people that's like an incredibly healing to be able to have like their say or on like a thing that happened to them that was terrible. And giving people that power of voice is really powerful.
Yeah, I think with that, we have to be aware as journalists as well that because we are using their story, like once they give us the quotes, it is then up to us to make sure that we don't mess it up. I think even for me personally, I would be quite nervous to give my story to somebody else. Like I feel very comfortable telling it myself. That's fine, no worries. But to give like a big amount of quotes to somebody and then they can go and do with it what they will. That's like, even to me as a journalist, that's still so I can definitely understand how that could be nerve-wracking to someone else who's never been like met a journalist before, you know?
And I think something where, I mean, at least from my perspective, when I was studying journalism at university, you're really taught that you shouldn't give someone the chance to read your article before you've written it or things like that. But I think when you're talking about trauma and you're talking about sensitivities, there is power in letting it be that more collaborative process. And maybe, it might not be the strict 101 old school journalism form to do that. But I think when you are dealing with someone who is sharing something so sensitive, there's a lot of power in letting them read it beforehand and giving them, I mean, it's still your words, but giving them the power to also craft their own words and have that as more of a collaborative process.
Yeah, I let everyone read any story I write. I know that a lot of old school journalists don't think that's good, but I completely disagree. I think, you're writing about someone's life and that is a big deal. And you have to be considerate of, maybe something you're saying might not seem like it's a big to you, but it might to them. And especially if they've just experienced trauma, I think it just helps a lot. Like I appreciate it when journalists let me read stories that are about me. So I give that courtesy to anyone else I write about, even if that's not the standard. I think it should be the standard, to be honest. Getting a chance to correct facts as well, because when you're in that mental state, and if someone gets something wrong, sometimes it can be quite additionally traumatizing. Like if you spelled someone's name wrong or something, that would be not a good thing if that person had, say, passed away or something. So I'm definitely a big believer in letting people read their work.
Yeah, I completely agree as well. Like with my book, I was sending transcripts to people as well as letting people read various drafts or like sometimes asking clarification questions later. I think it's really important that people feel a sense of ownership of their own story, like throughout the whole process. And they know that it's theirs and they can withdraw it if they need to or whatever.
Yeah. This actually goes, I'm going to switch gears a little here. And I wanted to talk about writing articles that touch on personal trauma. So it is a thing, I mean, and this is something that I feel like a lot of young journalists do end up experiencing is, writing articles that touch on your personal trauma or personal experience. So how have if you have done that before, how has it been received? And did you feel like when you shared it, was it cathartic or was it difficult? Was there unintended consequences that might have come from that? If anyone wants to start.
I mean, I've written about a lot of stories about myself, which maybe I shouldn't, but there's a lot. I've written about losing my dad and my pop to cancer. That was pretty tough. My own battles with mental health and chronic pain, my own bushfire experiences. I just like to look at it as an opportunity, I guess, to raise awareness about what you're experiencing and, advocate for change. And I think it helps release it too, because sometimes it's really hard to process these things, even if you have, speak to a psychologist or something. And I really like the idea of taking these like darker emotions and darker experiences and like transmuting them into something that can be powerful. Although I have had trolls, unfortunately, to some of them, particularly the mental health, like, oh my gosh, just people that are just awful. And, getting criticized that I was sharing my mental health because I'm a female, because that means it's a slow news day, because that's attention seeking, and like being teased for your appearance and stuff. It's like, that's not necessary. I mean, it is a really vulnerable place, I think, to share your trauma, but you just have to kind of ignore any potential trolls.
Yeah. So at where I work, 4 days a week, Science Alert, we do very much like newsy stuff. Like, it's not a lot of this kind of more in-depth things. However, before COVID, in the before times, we actually did a really interesting piece, so a lot more personal pieces about climate change and how that might affect us into the future. And I had pretty much exactly the same experience. I wrote some really beautiful pieces about like personal, like worries about climate change, things about the future, all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure there was a few people who actually got in touch with me and said that they loved it and it was beautiful and they really appreciated it. But if you looked at the comment section, it was horrible. So I definitely feel like there's a, I think putting yourself out there is really nerve-wracking and really scary. But even, I don't know, I'm okay with the trolls if it helps somebody. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a very emotionally kind of vulnerable thing. I mean, I've been writing for for many years now, and not really touched on many personal topics at all. Till very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, I wrote about Malaysia's currently having a debate around decriminalizing suicide. And I wrote an article talking about the experience of watching that debate as someone who survived suicide myself as a teenager. So that was a very full-on experience kind of. And I feel like part of for those of us who went to journalism school, the training is really drilled into you that you shouldn't share or that you shouldn't be vulnerable, or bring your own biases to a story. But I think those stories sometimes have the most impact. So, yeah.
I've written quite a bit actually on my own sort of trauma, especially like medical trauma. So around mental health and mental illness and like other chronic health issues. And yeah, it doesn't, like, on the day it gets published, you kind of like, I'm not able to concentrate on anything else, but I feel like it's helped me so much in working with other people's stories, because I know what that feels like to have like something out there. And I think that empathy and like also being able to tell people about like the risks and rewards is really helpful. But yeah, I think I don't know. I don't really look at comments or anything, so I don't know what sort of responses it's had. But when people reach out and say, "Oh, like thank you for saying that," like that's how I felt. That's why you do it. Like that's just an amazing feeling.
Yeah, don't read the comments. I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, very smart of you, Erin.
Not worth it. So I think that like segues nicely into the next question. Is there a way to write about trauma safely? Like, we're doing this every day. We're out there. This stuff, I mean, we've talked about it. It sticks with you. You end up with these, it's kind of like holes in the heart, like just little bits that kind of keep you up at night. So is there a way to write about it safely, or at least be a little bit safer? If anyone's got any thoughts?
I think it's just important to be open and honest with yourself and to monitor yourself for impacts of the trauma you may be dealing with. If things are a bit harder, if you're finding it hard to, settle down, if you're not getting joy from the things you used to, there's a pretty big warning signs that you kind of need to, either speak to a psychologist or debrief or something. Maybe if you are in an industry that has clinical supervision, that would be a great thing as well. And just having a self-care plan that you can kick into action when you're not feeling good with, what do I do when I'm not feeling like this? I think actually writing something down for me personally helps a lot, because when you're in that, I guess, state of not feeling great, you don't always remember what you're supposed to do to feel better. I think that definitely helps me. And then knowing you don't have to bear it alone, you can talk about it. Just because you didn't experience the trauma yourself doesn't mean that you don't get the secondhand impacts from reporting on it or working with it in any way.
Yeah, I think for me, like, therapists have therapists. So journalists, you're allowed to have a therapist. It's okay. I definitely also think that talking to somebody who might be a mentor, somebody who's been through this, who's done the long game, it's really helpful to have someone to kind of who's also in this field with you, who can say, yes, I'm feeling the same way. Here's how I deal with it. Like, and no matter what that might be, just talking to somebody and being there. And yeah, if you're able, obviously that's not a thing that everybody can do, but if you are able to, make sure you're talking to somebody, potentially someone who's licensed.
I think as well. You go. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think there's a real double-edged sword, I think, around journalism culture, in the sense that, like, on one hand, it is great to debrief with your colleagues when you're in a newsroom and you're in that environment, and you've spent all day watching the same traumatic footage as someone, or you've been editing the same story as someone. There's a real sense of camaraderie, and there's a lot of skills that come with being able to debrief with someone who actually understands what you're going through as well, like another journalist. But then there's also a real danger in some of the kind of grim humor that kind of comes out in the newsroom, and this kind of real, I don't know, trauma Olympics almost, of like who's seen the worst, or what's happened the worst, or who's got the most full-on story to share. Sometimes it can be quite problematic as well. So I think there's a real double-edged sword in terms of using colleagues and using the support that is around you. And, sometimes you get removed from a situation and you might be sharing what your workday was like to someone who's not a journalist, and they're just like, they're horrified that you can make a joke about it. But that's kind of sometimes the culture that comes with newsrooms, at least in my experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think like what everyone's saying has been sounds true to me as well. But I think the other thing that's worth thinking about is like taking a break and stopping, or like working if you can on something else that's more cheerful. Like I know it's really hard, especially like if you're working, as in the newsroom, or like you just got to work on the thing you're assigned. But just to be able to like go, oh yeah, I'm not feeling so great now. I'm going to maybe do something nice for a day, or like play some video games or something. Like stopping is such a useful tool, I think, for writers in general, because if you're writing all the time, it can be really hard to just sustain that practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like Jarni kind of mentioned this, but like being a bystander, being someone who just reads the news is very different to someone who's reporting on it. So how do we feel that reporting on trauma is different to those that are reading it on the page? I guess like reading news all the time might still have its own trauma associated with it. But as a journalist, like, what are we seeing? What are we doing? How do people know that it's actually different?
I think having worked in TV journalism, there's such a difference in the sense that, you're putting together, I remember quite vividly working on the Manchester bombings in 2017 and putting together a 2-minute package on that, which was a very carefully crafted, blurred out, edited experience. But to get to that experience for the viewer required me to spend about 3 hours trawling through footage of people coming out of the stadium in Manchester. So I think there's a lot of work that goes in behind crafting what is, and also deciding what is too traumatic and what is too graphic or too full on to show to an audience. But while they end up seeing a small picture of it, there's a lot of work that goes on behind that isn't really seen, and that does really take a toll as well.
Yeah, I think you're also just more invested. Like if you're interviewing someone directly, for example, you spoke to the person firsthand, you heard their troubles firsthand. Like, in a lot of cases, I've heard, people crying and stuff. And you have to put yourself in their shoes to write an effective story often. And, that doesn't really leave you. It kind of changes you, I think. And it is more than a story, I think, to journalists that really care about the people they write about. So, the news cycle is so quick. So someone just seeing a headline on Facebook or something for 2 seconds is completely different to being invested for however many period of time in this particular story, that it's just, I don't think people probably realize how much trauma is actually involved in reporting journalism. So I think it's completely different.
Yeah. Erin?
I guess it's also, it's fine for a piece about trauma to be upsetting to the reader. Like, as long as they're, correctly told up front that, hey, this is going to be through the headline or content warning or whatever. But yeah, I think you have a relationship with your sources that you can't really convey in words, and because it's not really about you, it's not about that relationship so much when you're actually doing the writing. And I think there's just so much that gets left out of an interview or of a story just for length reasons, that I think people don't get the full context of someone's story or every beat of it, which probably does make it seem maybe more tame than it really was. Yeah.
I think the other thing I'd add to that as well is that for me, especially when I'm doing a story, again, on something really important, maybe it's COVID and how misinformation has been spreading. If that story doesn't get the audience that I want it to, I feel like I've kind of failed a little as well. Because I'm telling somebody's story, or because I'm trying to get this really, to me, really important information out there, if the story doesn't do well or it's received badly, for me, I feel like I failed. I failed the person, or I failed I failed what I'm trying to do, and this journalism thing generally, which I feel like is not ideal. But yeah.
Yeah, I think there's importance in not taking on too, and realizing the limitations of journalism as well, and that you can tell a really important story, you can tell a really important issue, and that might not always lead to change, and being okay with that, and not. It's important to be invested in the story, but it's also important to maintain those boundaries and maintain your own mental health. And it is depressing when you see the kind of light, fluffy stories about people knitting jumpers for elephants that are always going to have more reads and views than the most important story that you've written. But I guess that's also just the way of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, knitting for elephants. I like that. So speaking of, you've written a great story. You're very happy with it. It goes out, and it's just, or something's happened, and you've had a really hard day at the office. How do you personally debrief after covering these kind of events? And I want to know your cross stitch. I want to know the music you listen to. What are you doing after you come home? The day's been really hard.
I cry.
Crying really helps sometimes.
It does, especially when it's something that, for example, I was interviewing someone the other day, and they were talking about how scary it was that they thought their father might have passed away in the fires. And having lost my dad, I was just crying, and having been in the fires. And it does bring up your own trauma often too. So my first thing is to let myself feel those emotions, and to, do the things I need to look after myself, whether that's making sure I eat food and drink water and all the other self-care things you generally forget when you're not feeling well. And doing things that you I guess, putting yourself into, I guess, a safe space. I personally like having a bubble bath with blasting some metal music with a good book. I find that very comforting and distracting, or a good game that just takes you out of your brain and lets you just escape for a little bit. I think that's very useful for me.
Sounds ideal.
On the topic of unhealthy newsroom cultures, I found going from working in a newsroom surrounded by other journalists to working from home in this kind of, post-COVID environment is that, my alcohol consumption has plummeted. So I think that's probably a lot healthier for me, and probably speaks a lot to the way that journalists learn to cope with trauma in perhaps unhealthy ways as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Mine's probably gone the opposite way, but that's all right. We'll get For me, I am a big fan of Cross Stitch. Like I said, a good book. I also do love at the bath. Cannot speak highly enough of a nice warm bath. And my Switch as well, and absolutely dominating all of my friends in Mario Kart.
For me, it's mostly watching TV, but like really bad TV. So reality TV or like dramas from, the 90s that like I sort of vaguely remember as a kid, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I love it. So talking about this, I think it's really bad for us to kind of say that we can just come home at the end of the day and get a bath and feel better, right? Like that's not how it works. That's not how trauma and these kind of things are going to actually happen. But there are ways I think that we can, if not minimize it, like look after ourselves in ways that might make it better. And so I think that also comes to your employer. So how has your employer, or if you're a freelancer, I guess, I don't know, it's a bit harder with that one. But how have the people around you that you work for supported you when reporting on trauma? Are there any ways they could have done this better?
I think there's a real space to upskill journalists in terms of how to support each other. Everywhere I've worked has had a EAP, an official kind of counseling service that you can go to, but it's not normalized into the culture to actually use those services. And I don't really know anyone who actually has used them, despite all of us going through traumatic stuff every day, or not every day, but on many days. So I think there's a real space in terms of how to upskill each other, how to upskill people to help each other in more of a daily normalized sense of the word. And yeah, as someone who's done lots of freelancing as well, it's just there's no support for freelancers at all, which is absolutely atrocious and should definitely be different.
Especially when freelancers get just as much, exposure to trauma as someone in a newsroom. I used to work in socials in a newsroom, and yeah, there was never any kind of conversation about mental health or encouraging anyone to use an EAP. I did use an EAP once, but it wasn't very effective. So you have to have need to normalize the conversation that people can seek help, but also make sure there's things they can seek help to actually work. I think there's this culture that we just get over it, and I think we need to eradicate that, because we'd be much better journalists if we are supported. I think there's a lot of room that organizations can do to support people, freelancers as well as staff.
I guess, as a freelancer, never gotten any, I've never had any conversation with anyone about protecting your mental health or anything like that. I have a background of mental illness, so I already have supports in place. I kind of know where to go if I'm feeling unwell, and I know how to recognize the signs and that kind of thing, but certainly not professionally. I've had editors who are definitely great and supportive and that kind of thing, but not on that kind of level. And certainly no one who would be able to identify oh, Erin's not doing that well today. I guess it's a big problem, because with fewer and fewer newsroom jobs, a lot more people are doing freelance, and it is a big problem that you have to already have in place non-professional supports. And then you're not necessarily getting the camaraderie of colleagues and that kind of thing. So it's such a big area that's completely ignored, I think.
Yeah. As someone who works in a completely online newsroom and has done long before COVID, I also feel like it's a lot easier to hide if you are not feeling super well. And I think that's something that we all have to be aware of as well, that your colleagues or yourself, if you're at your desk every day, but your desk is actually your bed, or any of those sort of things, it's a lot easier to kind of not have those, even if a colleague was going to notice in the office, they might not notice when you're at home. So yeah, being aware that I think it's only gotten worse since COVID, and I don't know how much is going to get better when we get back out again. So be aware of that as well. And employers, make sure you're aware of it. Yeah, has anyone, I've run out of questions. We've got quite a few minutes left, actually. So if anyone else has any other thoughts they wanted to add or any other things they wanted to discuss that you think that we haven't done yet, now would be a good time.
I think even just educating journalists that you can experience trauma, like nowhere in my whole degree was that ever mentioned. And that's just crazy. Like it should be, it really should be. And having actual pathways to support, like I think introducing, say, clinical supervision like psychologists have would be a great start. And, you know, allowing leave when people need it, job sharing if people have a mental illness, and if things get worse, to be able to be supported, and checking in and actually caring.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of newsrooms that kind of do churn through, especially young employees, and you get, you know, freelancers burnout, young journalists burnout. Like if people are going through all this effort to like get degrees or do all that kind of stuff, like I think it makes more sense for the employer as well to look after their journalists. Like look after them, they'll stay for you and they'll work for you. It's a win-win if people actually want to put in the effort.
Yeah, and I think it's about just normalizing the kind of everyday trauma that comes with journalism, and not seeing that as exclusively the realm of war correspondents or people who have been in terrorist attacks or whatever it might be, but kind of normalizing that, yeah, even sitting from a newsroom in Sydney or Melbourne, or sitting from your bedroom and looking at something traumatic, or having a phone conversation around trauma. I mean, those things have impacts, and it doesn't have to be, you don't have to have been in Syria to experience some of these impacts and have that be every day for you.
Erin, is there anything you want to add?
Nothing's really coming to mind. I feel like we've had like a really useful conversation. I think it is. I would just echo that it isn't really talked about enough, and I think just how commonplace trauma is. Like, so like there's different levels, obviously. Like as Jarni said, like, you know, we're not all in Syria every day, but even just vicarious trauma, it's like sometimes just listening to someone else's story can trigger something for you that might be unexpected, or you might realize over time that like, oh, like there's something here that doesn't feel quite right. And yeah, and I think journalists are in a particularly vulnerable position, often as first responders, but even when there's a bit more distance around that reporting. So yeah, I think just having that, like continuing that conversation is really important.
If you were to, I mean, I think it's probably important that like there are going to be lots of young journalists, young writers listening. So for the next generation of writers, even coming after us, what would you tell them? What advice would you give them if you were their mentor? Sorry.
I think it's like a mixture of taking care of yourself, and if your workplace isn't doing that for you, then like unfortunately that's probably something that you have to spend an ungodly amount of money, you know, doing like getting therapy and like talking to doctors and that kind of thing. But on top of that, I think there is like a lot of space to talk about these issues and campaign for actual change, and to you know, ask or demand of workplaces that they're more mindful of these issues. I think that dual, like, take care of yourself, but also if you can kind of make things a little bit better for the people coming next, that's probably like the best strategy.
Yeah. Zoe and Jarni, have you got advice for the next generation?
Yes. Sorry, I wasn't sure who was going to go first. I guess, yeah, definitely looking after yourself first. And, you know, if things I definitely noticed a lot of things in the industry that I think should change. But I think especially when you're a young journalist, it's scary to talk about those things because you wonder, oh God, if I say this, will I not get a job in journalism ever again? My career is over. And I think that stops a lot of people from speaking out about things that, you know, we do need to change in journalism, like not paying freelancers, unpaid internships, that people do work that is still triggering but don't get any kind of recognition, as well as not supporting your mental health. There is a lot of fear, I think, but I think just, you know, doing your best and that it's okay. And like, no matter how much trauma you have, it's okay. You can have like a tiny little impact that you might think is not important, or that you might think, oh, other people have it worse than me and mine doesn't matter, but it does matter. And I think you need to be mindful of that and put yourself first.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, what you guys have said is fantastic. I think it's just about learning to know when you need to take a step back from it, know when you need to kind of center yourself and not to feel selfish about that. And I guess not feel like you've got to do everything all the time, you know, and know that even if you do have to turn down a certain opportunity because you know, you're not coping at that time or whatever, other opportunities always around the corner, and you don't need, I mean, journalism is a very competitive field and it often does feel like a race and you've got to do everything all the time. But, you know, you don't have to do everything at all times. And, yeah, that if you do good work, then that will come through eventually, and you don't need to stress so much about having to put yourself out there all the time if you're not coping.
Yeah. I think that, yeah, I think like bit anti-capitalist here, but your workplace is not your friend. They're probably exploiting you. So make sure that you're doing your job. Like the job that you're doing is about you and about pushing yourself forward, but not about your organization. I think that's a big one that we as young journalists don't do a lot. We are very much like, oh yeah, sure, I'll take 10 cents a word or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. Whereas like we are worth so much more than that. And our stories, and especially our trauma, if you're writing about your, you know, like something that's really personal to you and really important to you, don't sell it for 10 cents a word. Like make sure that you're, you know, valuing yourself and valuing your experiences, because these experiences are what the newspapers are after. And yeah, I just think I feel like I've gone off a bit of a tangent there, but yeah, make sure that you're looking after yourself first. And that comes in so many different ways, but most importantly, look after. Don't trust your boss. Don't trust your boss.
I feel like our generation has gotten a lot of terrible advice about, like, oh, you should just go on and do this unpaid internship. Go and like just say yes to everything, even if you won't get paid. And it's like, no, that's actually terrible advice. Like, I would say if you're writing for free, like write for your blog or something. Like don't give it to like the intellectual property to someone else. Read your contracts. And I just don't think that we've been set up very well. Like it feels like we've been just told like you just need to work really, really hard and then like magically it'll be fine. And it's like it's not. No.
No. You deserve to be paid well, and exposure does not pay your bills. So we should be paid and paid well. I
very much agree with you, Erin. Write on your own blog. This is, again, we're getting a little off topic here, but yeah, write on your blog. If you're doing it yourself, even if no one's reading it, it shows that you are getting better at writing because you're writing all the time. And yeah, you don't end up having to give this story away that you might end up wanting to write later in a different way, but you're not able to now because the story's been like, you've used that story that's your personal trauma or your personal experience that's now been locked in a contract with some unethical provider. Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole different topic for a whole other day. I'm going to go all journalists on us and say if there's anything else we want to add, feel free to say it now, or I think we're pretty good.
It is the perfect journalism question. I've always gotten so much, like, such awesome material from, like, is there anything else you want to add?
It's the best. It's just, yeah. Although some people do tell me, they're like, no, why would you? You're like,
That's okay.
"Some
Okay, but
people do really well."
if that's the response 9 out of 10 times, like it's worth it for the 1 out of 10 times.
Absolutely. So any last final words before we finish up?
No.
I think we're good. All right. Thank you, everybody. I think we're a little bit early, but that's okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. The audience for watching. Hopefully these will be, and definitely make sure you go to some other events. I am assuming that the rest of us are all on other events as well. So make sure you watch those as well. And thank you so much for coming for NYWF. It has been lovely. And hopefully next year we'll all be in person again in Newcastle, which will be nice.